Yeah, I mean, it's just there, but I have it here. All right, all right. Welcome everyone to the second last MF CASR lunch of the semester. Um, so today we have Gregory Fewster, and it's a book talk about his very newly published book, about a month. Yeah,
about a month.
about a month. And it's called The Authentic Paul. Now the subtitle, Critical Scholarship at and the Making of a Christian Book. So that's what we're going to hear about today. It's a book talk, so we don't have to be as precise on the sort of 12 o'clock cutoff as we usually do. But Greg, you have about 15 minutes. And then we have our usual question and answers. If you're online, write it down in the chat and Fritjof will read it out to us. Yeah, I think that's all we need to say. Greg, please take us away.
Great, thank you. It's good to be here and on this side of the camera. I want to start with a question. How many of us have been in a biblical studies classroom or talked to somebody who took sort of an introductory biblical studies course? Yeah, so probably most of us in this room. So you might be familiar with an experience where you get into the classroom and you're ready to study the letters of Paul, and you encounter for the first time this really interesting fact that many scholars believe that not all of the letters that we have in the canonical New Testament were actually written by the historical Apostle Paul. So yeah, this is an experience that many of us have, and I think for a lot of people it sort of evokes some sort of feeling of, well, any number of feelings. It certainly can be contentious. For some people, it's unsettling. What about this letter that has been, sort of dear to my heart, not even written by the guy who I thought it was written by? For some people, this is exciting and maybe energizing in terms of new kind of questions and new ways of thinking about biblical texts and ancient historical texts. The authorship and the authenticity of the letters of Paul is a really ongoing and a kind of persistent debate that happens in modern biblical scholarship. And the stacks of our library just to my left, to your right, are full of these sorts of debates. And it's often kind of thought of as a prolegomena or introductory matters in studying the Bible, because you need to know who actually wrote the thing in order to be able to understand what it means. And if you don't know who the person who wrote it is, or if you think that it's somebody else who, other than what it actually says, then there are sort of some open questions. And in biblical studies, this question of the authenticity of the letters of Paul can fall under a different category, a number of different categories. And so we have questions of forgery. So, was 1 Timothy the entire letter written by Paul or not? Or 2 Thessalonians or Colossians, any number of entire letters, were they written by Paul or not? But it also figures into sort of smaller order questions. So what textual form do those letters take? So in the process of transmitting those letters from the hand of Paul or someone else to now, like, was there changes that were made, or were there changes that happened, what we call interpolations, that happened before those letters were sort of entering into that transmission period? Some people even think that letters like 2 Corinthians were made up of smaller pieces of letters and eventually brought together. And so this question of authenticity sort of operates at a number of different scales. And these are the sorts of questions that biblical scholars, again, seek to figure out before they can do the work of interpretation. These questions are also not entirely recent. So while a lot of modern biblical scholarship is interested in questions of authenticity, it's also ancient. You have, even in 2 Thessalonians, the author, maybe Paul, writing and saying, beware of this other letter that's sort of circulating in my name, but it's not really written by me. So the question of Pauline authenticity is important, it's aggravating, it has a long history, and people want to know about it. And sort of the significance of that question was really sort of motivating to me when I started my PhD, which is what my new book resulted from. And rather than asking questions about, why, or, how do we figure out what Paul actually wrote, things like this, I was really interested in why this mattered. Why are people asking these questions of authenticity? Why are they doing it so often now, and why have they been doing it for so long? And so this book is really my attempt to take a step back out of the sort of the confines of biblical studies, to take a step back and look at what motivates these sorts of questions, and what are the sort of disciplinary logics that propel the expression of this scholarly practice. So in this book, I approach that question from a number of different ways, or two kind of main different ways. And it's this approach that really gives, I think, the book as a whole its sort of energy, or its sort of momentum. So on one hand, I think about this in the context of book history. So I think about the letters of Paul in some ways, just like any other book. And so historians of the book will tell you that books are incredibly variable. They're subject to what one scholar calls the textual condition, which is to say that texts, when they enter the world, they are always in this state of mutation and change. And this is kind of an inevitability of textuality, and just sort of, in some ways, a neutral descriptor. And I'm also interested in viewing that question from the history of philology. So philology, or critical scholarship, which is a scholarly practice devoted to interrogating or studying those questions of mutation and textual variation, and seeking to bring some sort of order to that chaos. And so in some ways we have like this tug of war between the inevitability of mutation that text experience, and then the practice of critical philologists who are always seeking to sort of contain that and put some sort of like definitive boundaries and around that textuality, ascribe a correct author to it. When you take that sort of perspective and you step back and look at it, you start to notice something about authenticity, and this is where we start to get to sort of some of the definitional things that this book is trying to achieve. So a lot of us, especially from inside biblical studies or inside textual studies, think about authenticity as an ontological category of text. Authenticity is something inherent to text that we seek to recover. Authenticity is also something that can be destroyed. So when text changes, then therefore the inherent authenticity is somehow destroyed. And in some ways, this is how the debates happen. And so people get upset when they find out that a text has been changed, or get upset when someone decides that something is a forgery, but they think it's really not. But when you take a step backwards, like I did from this book, historical and sort of history of philology question, I started to think about authenticity in different ways, not as an ontological category, but as a constructed category. Authenticity is something that philologists do to texts. It's a constructed category, and it's in some ways a value that critics are conferring onto a particular textual formation. Assigning a text the label of authentic creates hierarchies between texts, and it values some texts above others. Authentic texts are more real, or more true, or have greater value for theological truth or something than inauthentic ones. And so the argument of the book then is that the authenticity of Paul's letters is not an ontological property that affirms the real Paul's activity in writing them. Rather, authenticity is a consequence of criticism. Authenticity is a consequence of the work that critics have done in the modern period, in antiquity, to sort of create an authentic corpus, to create a corpus that we think actually works for Paul. Or maybe another way to think about this is to move from the label authenticity to authentication. And so thinking about, authenticity as a practice that's being ascribed. In this book, and in reading through kind of the literature on the history of philology, I started to notice a number of different patterns and things that seem to be habitually happening in this process of authentication that I was really interested in tracing in the history of Pauline literature. So there's sort of two dynamics that I think that critics negotiate, which is what actually produces authenticity or generates this practice of authentication. So the one dynamic that they're negotiating is what literatures are actually kind of available to be authenticated. It's not sort of it's a choice to authenticate a piece of literature, or there's some traditions of scholarship that sort of determine which texts are allowed to be authenticated or not. And so, I mean, one example would be sort of the debates that happened in the 18th century about whether the Bible itself was allowed to be treated with sort of the tools of critical philology. Some people thought it wasn't. Some people thought it was. And so authenticity is generated through that debate about whether this text is even a legitimate recipient of authentication. And the other one is what critics are actually allowed to participate in that task. The history of literature or the history of philology is full of people who become philologists because they are kind of trying to defend their reputation as critics, or the scholars like Jerome or Erasmus. It's been shown some of their reputation is not just because they were really good critics, but because they were actively there promoting themselves as the true critic. And so I argue, or I see in the history of philology in general, and I see in the history of the philology of the letters of Paul, this authenticity emerging from the negotiation of these two dynamics. Maybe another way to say it is that the authenticity of literature and the authenticity of the critic are sort of co-constituting. So this is what I just sort of outlined for you is basically what I established in the introduction of the book, and sort of the main sort of theoretical and methodological premises that approach, or that frame my approach to the literature. And the rest of the book is essentially kind of case studies and drawing those arguments out. And so I've chosen a number of different episodes in the history of the scholarship on Paul that sort of illustrate how this authenticity is produced. And this sort of required some selectivity in the historical record. Oh, yeah, sure. This book is not comprehensive or exhaustive in any way. If it was, it would be, quite large. Rather, I was interested in kind of identifying this sort of trans-historical dynamic that I think is present in the history of Paul. And so I was trying to find episodes in which this could sort of be illustrated. And as it's going around, you'll sort of notice that the episodes that I selected kind of cluster in antiquity and in modernity. And this has to do with some kind of internal debates in scholarship on the history of philology that I don't need to get into. I was also interested in sort of balancing known and unknown. So for example, F.C. Bauer is a very famous critic of the Apostle Paul, who famously determined that only Romans, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians were Pauline. He features in the introduction, but I didn't do a whole chapter on Bauer because he's just sort of been done to death. I wanted, to find other things maybe that balanced a little bit of familiarity for scholarship and sort of challenging some conventional wisdom there, but then also finding episodes that are kind of unknown in the history and kind of pulling those out and exposing them for readers. And there's a kind of an interesting challenge in selection too, because in antiquity, there's a real paucity of evidence. So we have in antiquity a lot of claims of people having ideas about what is authentically Pauline and what is not, but we don't actually have evidence for how they actually work that out. So if we think about philology as a practice that generates authenticity, we don't actually have much evidence of that practice in play. So when Eusebius, for example, says, the churches are reading these books, but they don't think these books are in play, or the Muratorian canon says, beware of the fraudulent epistle to the Alexandrians or Laodiceans. These are claims, but they're not argumentation that can be analyzed. And so it's kind of, I had to kind of search for actual instances of places where you can sort of measure that, and debates over the character of Marcion and his sort of Pauline canon was one interesting place for me. On the other hand, when you get into modernity, you have too much evidence, and there's just so much literature that has been generated in the 18th and 19th and 20th century in which these debates are happening. And so then I had to be selective in another way, and the chapter on the third epistle to Corinthians. So in the Bible, we have the first and second epistle. There's also a third one in circulation, most modern scholars think that had that's not authentic, but I was interested in kind of finding out why. What is the history of this decision that generated that? Another interesting challenge of working with the modern literature is that literature is for biblical scholars secondary literature. And we are accustomed to seeing it as sort of our intellectual forebears and the people that we kind of frame our relationship to. But I was taking a step back and having to analyze it. So that as like a piece of primary literature. So that was like a really interesting challenge for me as a writer, and I think is also a challenge could be a challenge for readers, which I hope that they are able to sort of suspend their maybe attachments to that literature in certain ways. So just in conclusion, as I wrap it up, I just want to maybe note two takeaways, two categories of takeaways. One is for Pauline scholars in particular, and one is for philologists. And maybe other people could take away things from the book, but these are sort of two communities that I'm interested in speaking to. So for Pauline scholars, I think it's important to identify that this book is not an argument about what Paul may or may not have written. And this is because of how I understand authenticity. So again, authenticity is not an ontological category in my reckoning, but a value attributed to text. So you shouldn't come to this book and expect me to make a proclamation about what is or is not Pauline, but I'm simply sort of describing and analyzing that practice. And I also want to challenge the idea that authenticity, or to suggest that authenticity is not the objective basis for historical or theological constructions. It doesn't necessarily need to be a prolegomena thing, but it's when we imagine something as the authentic letters of Paul, these are one scholar's formulation of that. And when doing historical or theological study, that's a different way of orienting yourself to that literature, I think. And I think this should sort of free the Pauline scholar up to engage kind of multiple or plural formulations of what the authentic Paul is. Feel free to experiment and to challenge theological or scholarly orthodoxies. For philologists, I want you to understand that this is not a deconstructive takedown of philology. I myself continue to be a philologist and a practicing philologist, and in some ways this book is sort of a love letter to philology. I don't know. But one takeaway is like, oh, philology is a subjective practice. It's subject to certain conditions and traditions and things like this. And this is not a negative characterization, but just a neutral description of how I think that the field operates. Philology, I think, is a powerful tool. It is by being close to text and by struggling with them, it opens our eyes to the contingency of text. But it also is a tool that sort of presents literature to the world. And so it has a lot of power in that sense. And so I think that philologists need to have a certain degree of reflexivity and appreciate sort of the power that they wield in their hands, to use that power with caution, but also to wield it with certain potential and to understand that the work that you do can be very generative for certain kinds of historical or theological projects. So yeah, not a deconstructive negative thing, but sort of hopefully for both Pauline scholars and philologists, this book can be an empowering tool. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Really interesting.